Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Renee and Alexander Bohm Memorial Lecture, where we will hear Dr. Tzvi Novick speak on the topic of Does Jewish law recognize righteousness? Dr. Tzvi Novick is the Abraham's Jewish Thought and Culture Professor of Theology at the University of Notre Dame, and his research focuses on early rabbinic literature and early Jewish liturgical poetry. This is part of our Fallsman programming at Drisha, and we're glad to have Dr. Novick here as a guest lecturer. Good evening.
Good evening. Thank you for having me. Should I just get started then?
Please do.
Okay. All right. Okay. And I'm going to be sharing a screen with you. Let's see if that technology will work. Okay. And okay. So hopefully you can see this PowerPoint. And no, Just Learning raised a hand. So I don't know if that was part of Just Learning. Okay. But that does remind me to mention that you should feel free to stop me at any point, ask questions, make comments, and ideally also, in fact, use that hand, that yellow hand, because then it comes to my attention via Zoom. Whereas if you're simply raising a hand, then I might not see it because I can't see all of the video boxes. All right. Okay. So does Jewish law recognize righteousness? That's a little bit of an obscure question. And what I want to do is first kind of clarify the question, clarify the dilemma that I want to examine in the lecture, and then try to work toward presenting a solution or one of a set of solutions to it. All right, so well, I want to frame the problem, the dilemma, by reflecting on a general question in the study of early rabbinic law, and the focus of my research. One of the foci of my research has been the structure of early rabbinic law, and I'll be making references to some of that research as we go, and then to zero in on the question of righteousness. So I've titled this slide Law versus Ethics in Rabbinic Judaism. And the verses here is the key thing. What I want to be kind of setting forward here is the existence of an apparent tension between law and ethics in Rabbinic Judaism. So I'll start with this question of normative structure. So normativity, meaning normativity is the way in which we speak about how one ought to behave. And there are different ways of speaking about how one ought to behave. A law-like normativity, when we're speaking about how one ought to behave within the framework of law, or within the framework of an ethics that is indebted to the rhetoric of law, then we're speaking about categories like must not, may, right? You must do X, you may not do X, you may not do Y, you may do Z, etc. That's a law-like normative structure. And then alongside that, we have normative structures that I'm calling here virtue-like, that indicate what one should do, that describe the virtues, justice, courage, things like that, that involve character, either in the sense of, speaking about someone as having good character or having positive characteristics, or can speak about what are positive characteristics, what are negative characteristics. One can think about exemplars, or the idea, right, of imitating models, or of avoiding negative models, or anti-models, as it were. So this is one way of categorizing or of speaking about law versus ethics. There are two different sets of ways of talking about what one ought to do. And we often kind of find these, at least at first glance, a tension in the basic structure of rabbinic law. So when we speak about halakhah, we can speak about din, and then lifnim mishurat hadin, what the law is, and then what is within the bound of the law, whatever defining the term lifnim mishurat hadin is a challenge, but it describes acts that are not commanded, but what one ought nevertheless to do. And these are kind of two separate categories, and there's that boundary between them, the din and the lifnim mishurat hadin. Or we can think about the structure of the Mishnah, the foundational work of rabbinic law, where pretty much every tractate, other than one, uses the basic rhetoric, the basic categories of a law-like normativity: must, may not, right? Asur, mutar, chayav. And then one has Pirkei Avot, which doesn't employ those categories. And right, it's often translated as the ethics of the fathers. One marker of the difference between them is that the negation that's used in the Mishnah when you're speaking about law is lo. Ben Vayomer le'emet v'yatziv lo yafsik, between the paragraph of Vayomer, the last paragraph of the Shema, and then the following paragraph of emet v'yatziv lo yafsik. One should not, one may not stop, one may not pause. Lo, but that's characteristic. Whereas in Pirkei Avot, the characteristic negation is al. Al tifrosh min hatzibur. Do not separate from the tzibur. Al tadin et chaverach ad shetagir imkomo. Don't judge your neighbor until you've come to his place. So al is the characteristic negation, and that's the negation that's characteristic of good counsel, the should. You'll find it also in what's called the biblical wisdom literature, Proverbs, etc. So the point of reviewing these categories, well-known categories, is just to establish that there is sort of a fundamental tension within the rabbinic tradition between law and ethics, where they are both kind of conveyed within the rabbinic normative system writ large, and yet have their separate domains. The Mishnah as a whole, Pirkei Avot, din lifnim mishurat hadin. And so the question that I've been asking in my research, really kind of starting with my dissertation and then kind of on and off amidst other inquiries, is to what extent do we find bridge categories within halakhah, within halakhic discourse, that nevertheless incorporate gesture toward ethics, or a normativity that is centered in virtue, in character, in exemplars. So what we could call bridge concepts that complicate this dichotomy and blur this dichotomy between law and ethics. So, right, the law if we're kind of standing within the arba amot halakhah, within the 4 cubits of the law, do we need to conceive of ethics simply as kind of that which is beyond law, or is there within legal the discourse of law and halakhah itself an incorporation of these other kinds of normative, or these features of other kinds of normativity? So this is the way, this talk is based on a forthcoming paper, and this is the way I put it in that paper. Law prescribes what one must do, must not do, and may do. It does not, as such, describe or model what one should do. Right? We don't look to the law to model what we should do. The law is kind of like a floor, but that's not what you should do. You ought to go beyond it. At least at first glance, the law seems capable of processing excellence, perfection, holiness only as excess, as that which is beyond what the law demands. And from the opposite perspective, to celebrate virtue and perfection seems inevitably to marginalize the law as a second best, or to encourage allegoresis, allegorical interpretation of it. All right, and this is the problem that you encounter when you run into kind of a system like Philo's, ancient Jewish philosopher, who kind of is very much centered in a Greek ethic of perfection, virtue, and ends up attributing kind of only chiefly allegorical value to the law, but not the value of the law as commanding what one may or may not or must do. So that's the dilemma. And the solution or the nuance would lie in the identification of bridge concepts, categories within halakhah that gesture also toward an idea of perfection, of excellence, of virtue. And so what are some of those bridge concepts? So mitzvah, I think, is one. Right? Mitzvah, of course, is the term for a commandment, and it's in some sense the very foundation of the law. Right? The Rambam's Mishneh Torah is organized in part around the identification of different commandments and then the classification into different categories. But on the other hand, we have a usage of the word mitzvah, where mitzvah signifies precisely what you don't need to do, but you ought to do. Right? It's a mitzvah, right? You don't need to do it, but it's a mitzvah to do, right? And that's a kind of, in our modern discourse about mitzvah, but that usage has roots within the earliest stratum of Tanaitic halakhah. So mitzvah is this category that is actually an interesting bridge category between the law or something that blurs the boundary between the legal and the ethical, or between a discourse of may not, and must, and a discourse of perfection, the ideal, right? Whereas the law is simply the floor. Ritual is another category where that incorporates within itself a kind of legal dimension, but then also a kind of demand of perfection, even an aesthetic. Aesthetics is also kind of associated with virtue, making of oneself or creating a character, fashioning character. There are aspects of aesthetic in the rhetoric of perfection and character that you don't have in law. And so in ritual also, you have a yatsa yedei chovato, one has fulfilled his obligation, some basic steps that you need in order to fulfill your obligation, and there's the obligatory, there's the law, and yet there is also a lechatchila, what you ought to do from the first. In other words, some kind of perfect way of achieving this ritual. And so it's a concept that is halakhic, right? We have all sorts of halakhic rituals, obviously, many of them associated with korbanot in the Beit HaMikdash, but certainly many of them which survive to today, the Seder, Tefillah, etc. And there is a yatsa yedei chovato, kind of a legal element to it, of chovah, what one must do, but then also within that very category, a sense of how to do, being perfect. So that's another bridge concept. A third, and those first two are ones that I explore in that book, What is Good and What God Demands, and I have pictured over here. The third is one that I explored in a contribution to this other volume that's depicted here, Character, New Directions from Philosophy, Psychology, and Theology. I contributed there an article on etiquette in rabbinic law. And etiquette is a really, really interesting category, right? Etiquette is, to some extent, it's this kind of the slightest sort of normative things. It's just politeness. On the other hand, people get quite upset about breaches of etiquette, and it can be quite compelling. Have a really powerful normative force. And etiquette is very interesting because it's rule bound, right? There are rules of etiquette. We speak about rules of etiquette, but at the same time, it's unlike the law. Etiquette makes a lot of use of exemplars, and in order to know what good etiquette is, you imitate others, and you can find that in rabbinic discussions of etiquette very frequently advert to models. So they say, look at Rabbi Yochanan, and how Rabbi Yochanan puts on his shoes, that sort of thing. And so etiquette is also a category that sort of blurs the boundary between law and a kind of ethic of perfection. This is obviously not something that we can enter into detail now, because this is all by way of background to the question of the tzaddik, or the righteous person, or righteousness. And what I want to be arguing essentially is that the category of the tzaddik, the righteous person, is another one of these bridge categories. Another one of these ways, and I guess another way to put it is another one of these ways in which halakhah shows itself to be not simply a floor, and not simply law in the modern, say, American sense of it, or Western sense of it, of rules that one must abide by, but a pathway to perfection, and that one who observes the law, precisely because they observe the law, and not going beyond it, but precisely because they observe the law can become perfect. And that's kind of, so that's another way of expressing the possibility of these bridge concepts, these concepts that enable us to see the law not simply as the floor that is then exceeded by an ethics of perfection or holiness, but actually a vehicle through which one achieves perfection. All right, so to the righteous individual, the tzaddik. So the tzaddik is obviously a category that the rabbis don't invent. They inherit the category of the tzaddik from the Bible. And in the Bible, there are two major usages of the category tzaddik. One is the one that we're most familiar with and that we invoke when we translate tzaddik as righteous. It is the sense of righteousness, and as opposed to the rasha, who is wicked, the tzaddik and the rasha. And then there's also a forensic sense, the sense of innocence, forensic meaning a courtroom sense, right? What one can speak within the context of judicial procedure of a tzaddik and a rasha, where tzaddik is an innocent person or a person who is found innocent, a person who is acquitted, and the rasha, the guilty person. But this is not a character statement. This is a statement about the particular facts at hand, in the particular case at hand. All right, so that's the biblical background. And now we'll come to the rabbinic background. So the rabbis preserve this basic sense of the tzaddik as righteous. And maybe let's have a look at this first text, which is as an example. So this is from Tosefta Sota. Bizman tzaddikim ba'in la'olam, when the righteous come into the world, tova ba'a la'olam, goodness enters the world. Ufur'anut mistaleket min ha'olam, and punishment, disaster, is removed from the world. Uchesheniftarin min ha'olam, when they are niftar, when they pass on, when they exit the world, pur'anut ba'a la'olam, v'tova mistaleket min ha'olam, then punishment comes to the world and good is removed from the world. And then in the continuation, I'm skipping over something in the middle. And not only do the righteous suspend for the world, meaning suspend punishment while they are alive, alone, but even in their death. As it says, etc. And it was after 7 days, then the waters of the flood came upon the land. So that this is obviously in the story of Noah. So what's the nature of those 7 days? Why 7 days until the water appeared? These are the 7 days of mourning for Metushelach, the righteous, that prevented the disaster, prevented punishment from coming to the world. So even in his death, Metushelach was able to forestall the arrival of the flood for the 7 days of his mourning. All right, so this is a very typical usage of tzaddik in the sense of righteous, Metushelach hatzaddik, or hatzaddikim ba'in la'olam, and then they benefit the world in virtue of their presence. So that's the typical usage. When it comes to the forensic usage, right? So the sense of tzaddik in the sense of innocent, in innocent, that is to say, the subject of a finding of innocence in court, that falls out in rabbinic literature. You only essentially find that usage when they are interpreting a verse that uses tzaddik in that way. They recognize that the Bible uses it in that way, but they don't use it themselves in that way. And so here's just an example. From Chilted Rabbi Ishmael, a Tana'itic commentary in the book of Exodus. So if a person leaves the court innocent, there was a finding of innocence, but then after he leaves the court, they discover new grounds for conviction. Right? I might think he will be guilty. He should be counted guilty. They should bring him back to court and find him guilty. Talmud Lomar v'tzadik al taharu. Therefore, hence the verse says, do not kill a tzaddik, do not kill an innocent person. If he's been found innocent, then that finding needs to remain. This is, in other words, a prohibition against double jeopardy. Once the person has been tried and found innocent, he cannot be tried again on the same charge. And so here they are recognizing this usage of tzaddik in the sense of innocent. but that's the only context in which you find tzaddik being used in rabbinic halakhah. In other words, when tzaddik is not really used in halakhah in general. The category of tzaddik isn't a category in halakhic discourse. There are no halakhot. There are no laws that govern tzaddikim. There are no laws that are about tzaddikim. Right? The only way in which tzaddik, right, the law doesn't judge a person on whether they are a tzaddik or not. They retain this usage of tzaddik in the sense of innocent, or they know of this biblical usage, and so that figures in halakha. But there is no halakha that turns on the question of whether this person is a tzaddik or not. The category is not recognized by the law. There is one possible exception. There is one exception. It's a very, very interesting exception, which it's the case of the turned city. Right? What happens if this is in the halakhah and Devarim? What happens if a city has been turned toward idolatry, and so the entire city is now worshiping idolatry, and so the entire city is to be destroyed. And so the rabbis kind of confront this dilemma. You know, is this in fact the halakhah that the entire city even right? Under what circumstances is the entire city destroyed? Are those who are innocent destroyed too, or to be killed also? And then what happens also to the property? So lots of complicated halachot here. But here's one example of ways of one case where it matters whether one is righteous. Nichsei tzadikim shebetocha ovdin shebechutz la pleitin. So the property of the righteous within the city is destroyed. Outside of it, it escapes. In other words, if there's a righteous inhabitant of the city or an innocent inhabitant of the city, if he has property located within the city, then it is destroyed as part of the general destruction of the city. But if his property is located outside of the city, then not. Whereas for the wicked, that is to say, those who have worshipped idolatry, then whether they are inside or outside of whether their property is inside or outside of the city, it is destroyed. So here, the category of tzaddikim and rishaim are being used, even though the law itself in the Bible, the law of the turned city doesn't mention tzaddikim, doesn't mention rishaim. And so why exactly the words tzaddikim and rishaim are being used here to describe innocent and guilty, when the Bible itself doesn't use these terms in this context, is a question. I think for the sake of time, I'll kind of put a pin in that, and then maybe we can come back to that if there is time. But in general, to go back to that opening slide, in general, that forensic usage is not employed in rabbinic literature, and in rabbinic literature, tzaddik in general means simply a righteous person. And it's not used in halakhah, right? Halakhot, right? Generally, kind of, they don't turn on. There are no laws that differ whether on or that turn on the question of whether a person is righteous or not. All right. So now that's all to set up these passages, and these are two well-known passages, but I think there is what to learn from them, something new to learn from them about the nature of the tzaddik in rabbinic thought, and in particular, the possible role of tzaddik as a bridge concept in the way that I was introducing earlier. So this passage is less well-known than the one that we'll get to in a second, but this is a passage that describes the judgment day, presumably, the final judgment. It's from Tosefta Sanhedrin. Beit Shammai Omrim. Beit Shammai says, Shalosh kitotein. There are three groups. Achat l'chaye olam, ve'achat l'cherafot l'dera'on olam. So one for eternal life, and one for reproaches for eternal abomination. These are allusions to a verse in the book of Daniel, Sefer Daniel. So who are those who are for eternal life? The tzaddikim gemurim, the utterly righteous people. And then who are those who are destined for reproaches, for eternal abomination? Right, one goes under the name hellfire in other contexts. Elu rishaim gemurim, these are the utterly wicked. shkulin shebahen. And then the third group, what's the third group? The equipoise, the ones who are weighted kind of where the scales are equal. Yordin legehinom, umitzaftzefim ba, ba'olin hemena, umitrapin. They descend to Gehenna, and they are singed there, and then they rise from it and are healed. This is a verse in Zechariah. I shall bring the third through the fire. All right, so here we have this idea of three groups for the final judgment: tzaddikim gemurim, utterly righteous people; rishaim gemurim, utterly wicked people; and then the shkulin, the equally weighted people, the equipoised people, the people in the middle. All right, and so this is one usage of tzaddik that I want to think about. And then the other one, the better well-known one, and these are cited, these two sources are cited one after the other in the Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud in Rosh Hashanah. But the other one is about the annual judgment, the judgment of Rosh Hashanah. And there too, and almost, I think it's quite likely that this famous teaching about three groups of people in judgment for Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippurim is actually based on this earlier statement attributed to the house of Shammai about three groups of people in the final judgment. And then the annual judgment and the idea of these three groups is modeled on the final judgment. In any case, this passage from Yerushalmi Rosh Hashanah in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, I didn't cite the whole passage because I take it to be familiar enough, but it describes three records, Pinaksim, or Pinkasim, three Pinaxes, that of the utterly righteous, the Tzaddikim Gemurim, the utterly wicked, the Rishaim Gemurim, and then the middling. In this case, it's called the middling, the Benoniim. And then the utterly righteous and the utterly wicked receive their judgments on the new year. Whereas the middling, they're given the 10 days of repentance, the Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, and then on the Day of Atonement, they are written either with the Tzaddikim or with the Rishaim, depending on what they do during those 10 days. All right, so my question is, what is the usage of tzaddik in these sources? Right, who are the righteous here? Right, so we saw in these rabbinic texts, they can speak of these kind of heroically righteous individuals like Metushelach. When tzaddikim come to the world, then tova ba'ala olam, good comes to the world, and pur anut mistaleket, punishment is taken away. And like Metushelach, even in his death, the flood is postponed, the destruction of the entire world is postponed for 7 days because of mourning over Metushelach. So we have that model of the righteous. And then we have tzaddik in the sense of innocent, which is not used productively in rabbinic literature. It's used mainly, again, in these exegetical contexts where the Bible is speaking about innocent people. But who are the righteous in these texts, in these two texts about the final judgment and the annual judgment day? What conception, what is the category, what is the conception of the category of tzaddik that comes through in these texts? And it's a bit of a puzzle over here because right, it's the category doesn't it certainly encompasses a figure like Metushelach. It certainly encompasses like a heroically righteous figure like Metushelach, but it doesn't only encompass Metushelach, right? It's a category that extends downward even to those who are just slightly above average, slightly above the status of Benoniim. And it doesn't only indicate the innocent, because innocence, to some extent, that interpretation of tzaddik as innocent seems to be the appropriate one in this context because we're talking about judgment, right? And judgments is a case where you have acquittal or a finding of guilt, innocence or guilt, and it's binary. But on the other hand, that meaning of tzaddik as innocent is not one that can be modified adjectively. right? You don't speak of someone who is utterly innocent. I mean, we have a sense of innocence, maybe of like naivete or like childlike innocence, and then you can kind of modify it adjectively, like with childlike or utter. But innocence in the forensic sense of a finding of innocence is not subject to adjectival modification. And so one can't speak of tzaddik gamur if tzaddik over here means innocent. And so on the one hand, the category can't refer only to the righteous in the sense of the sort of righteous people where and when they enter the world, good comes into the world, because it extends downward even to someone who is just above Benoni or Shakul. And then on the other hand, it can't indicate simply innocence, because then the idea of modifying that with the adjective gamur, utterly righteous, utterly innocent, wouldn't make sense. And so, in short, what we seem to have here is a synthesis of these two categories that produces really something new, which we could call the scalar tzaddik, right? A scalar in the sense of a scale, right, or a spectrum, where the category of tzaddik is encompassing really everyone who is everyone from the slightly better than average all the way to the heroic tzaddik, the figure like Metushelach, who is the sort of individual who can influence and impact the very fate of the world theologically. And this idea of tzaddik is a kind of a scalar category encompassing many sorts of people and many gradations of individuals is something that you find at many points in rabbinic literature. I cite here on this slide Sifrei Deuteronomy, the Tannaitic commentary on Sefer Dvarim. Sheva Kitot, this is just an excerpt from it, obviously. Sheva Kitot shel tzadikim began Eden, zo lemala mizo. There are 7 groups of the righteous in the Garden of Eden, this one above that one, in ranks. And then there are other rabbinic passages that describe even more kitot, even more groups of righteous individuals. There's even one rabbinic passage that interestingly speaks of tzaddikim gemurin on the one hand, utterly righteous people, and then tzaddikim benoniim, average righteous people. That's not a phrase that occurs very often in rabbinic literature. I think it only occurs once in Vayikra Rabbah, but happy to hear other thoughts. Oh, I see, by the way. Okay, it occurred to me to check this chat. So let's see. So let me just wrap up this sentence, and then I'll check the chat. So for questions, but you should also, again, feel free to raise hands, the yellow hands ideally, with questions. So so this category then of the scalar tzaddik, of this category that encompasses everything from just above average all the way to the heroically righteous, right, is something then that we see emerging in rabbinic literature, and to which a number of sources are devoted. Oh, and I see, I guess, that question of Azi Orbach about a definition of tzaddik as one whose good deeds outweigh their bad deeds, right, is essentially this one that we're finding in these texts about judgment. But it's important to note that category extends all the way up to the tzaddikim gemurim, right, the utterly righteous. So Kayla, you've got a hand.
Yes, I just want to highlight a question from the Facebook live chat.
Oh, okay.
We from a Mr. Lawrence Kaplan, he made a comment that Maimonides espoused an ethics of perfection and yet rejected allegorization of the law. And for Maimonides, obedience is in service of virtue.
Okay, you're right. So yeah, so I mentioned Philo as someone whose deployment of an ethics of perfection and of virtue led him toward allegoresis, and it's kind of the obstacle that a kind of philosophical approach to or a virtue or kind of a virtue-centered approach to normativity has to confront within a rabbinic framework. How do you end up retaining the force of the law as law? And so Maimonides does manage to find a place for it. I mean, yes, there's a virtue of obedience. Maimonides also speaks in the Guide of the Perplexed as of the law as a as a kind of a training ground for contemplation, or an opportunity within which to kind of cultivate a contemplation of God. And so, so what one can do that. There are different strategies toward accomplishing it. So that's important to note. It's not a trap that everyone will necessarily fall into, but it's a trap that anyone who is kind of following that path is almost inevitably aware of. Great. Okay. So to kind of complete this argument for the idea of the tzaddik as a bridge concept, it's important at this point to bring in the chassid. Right. So if we're talking about, it's interesting to think about kind of major kind of figures or types within rabbinic thought. So Gershon Sholem has an essay, a well-known essay about different types of Jewish piety, and he identifies the tzaddik and the chassid and the Talmid Chacham, the sage, as paradigms of Jewish piety. There are rabbinic texts that put these side by side: the tzaddik, the chassid, the Talmid Chacham, also the tzanua, though that's a figure that doesn't come up as often. But the tzaddik and the chassid are in particular productive to think about together. And I want to kind of, because this is a kind of a basic insight of structural linguistics, that nothing within a system of signification, nothing means by itself. Things mean by virtue of contrast to other signs within the system. And so to an important extent, the significance of the tzaddik, what the tzaddik means within rabbinic thought, depends in part on the way in which it's playing off, the figure of the tzaddik is playing off the figure of the chassid. And so the chassid, the pious person, holy person. So obviously plenty of literature on the chassid. The chassid, of course, is most familiar to us from its from the social circles that assign it a particular signification in the 18th century and forward. But then there are also Hasidei Ashkenaz in the medieval period, and other kind of usages of this category, Hasidayo, all the way back in the Maccabean period. We're talking about the chassid of classical rabbinic literature. And I want to know two things about that distinguish the tzaddik from the chassid. The first is that the chassid is a real social type in a way that the tzaddik is not. And what do I mean by that? Well, one thing one implication of that, or one evidence for this distinction, is the fact that one can tell stories about a chassid. The chassid is a clear enough, distinctive enough character that you can tell story, that you can use a chassid as a character in a story, because people that will generate expectations, right? It's like in a genre, like the rules of a genre generate expectations, and then the author can work off of those expectations. And you can do that with a chassid because the chassid is a defined enough social type. And so you can have stories, ma'aseh b'chassid echad, a story concerning a certain chassid. And you never have a story that begins with ma'aseh b'tzaddik echad, a story concerning a certain righteous person. And so this is a nice story that, maybe I'll just go through briefly, so I have a little time. Ma'aseh b'chassid echad, this is in Genesis Rabbah, Bereshit Rabbah, the Amoraïc commentary on the book of Genesis, in connection with the story of Adam and Eve. Ma'aseh b'chassid echad shehaya nasui l'chasida echad. A story about a chassid who was married to a chassidah. The feminine form chassidah is rare, but it does occur, just like you have the feminine form tzaddiket more commonly. And they did not raise children one from the other. A very, very interesting kind of symmetric usage, though there's a lot of textual issues. I'm just citing the basic text in the Theodor Albeck edition, but there are lots of variants. Amru, en anu mo'ilin la'akadosh baruch hu klum. We are not providing any benefit to the Holy One, blessed be He. Also a very interesting statement. If they're not providing offspring, then they're not benefiting God. Amdu v'gerushu ze et ze. And even a more interesting reciprocal statement. They divorced one another. Divorce is not typically a reciprocal thing in rabbinic halakhah. But anyway, these are all kind of subtle details that we'll have to leave to the side in the name of kind of pursuing our objective of distinguishing the tzaddik and the chassid. Halach ze v'nasa b'sha'a achat v'asta oto rasha. So this one, the chassid went, the man went and married a wicked woman, and she turned him into a rasha. Halachazo v'niset l'rasha v'asta oto tzaddik. And then she, the chassidah, went and married a rasha and transformed him into a tzaddik. And thus one sees that everything is from the woman. Right? It depends, the ultimate kind of the determinative status of the couple is from the woman. So a very, very interesting story for a lot of reasons. What drew me to this story in particular was the way in which the categories of chassid and tzaddik are being used here. And the categories of tzaddik and rasha come up in the continuation. Asa oto, she marries rasha, and she transforms him into rasha, and then vice versa with a tzaddik. So those categories come up in the continuation, but the story is about a chassid, ma'aseh b'chassid echad. And this is typical. You have any number of stories in rabbinic literature about a chassid, a certain chassid, but no stories about a tzaddik. And this is because evidently the chassid is a social type, a character, right? To some extent a character in the sense like we use like a real character, but someone who distinctive enough, again, to generate narrative expectations. Further, so the question about whether one could argue that this story has halachic implications, that one's Jewishness is dependent on the woman. As it is interesting, kind of whether this agadah, whether this narrative is kind of to some extent aware of and building off of the halachic rule, that the matriarchal principle that the status depends on the woman. It's interesting to think about. But further evidence for this distinction between chassid and tzaddik comes from the fact that a chassid can be used as a moniker, or especially in the Aramaic form chasida, so affixed to a proper name, whereas tzaddik is not used that way, with rare exception like Binyamin HaTzadik, or Yosef HaTzadik. Yosef HaTzadik actually doesn't come up nearly as often as one would think in classical rabbinic literature. It comes up in very late midrashic literature, but not in classical rabbinic literature. But in general, tzaddik is not used as a moniker that way, whereas chassid is. So that's one important difference between them. And then the other difference that I wanted to point to is the way in which they contrast differently with the middling figure, the Benoni. Right, so you'll recollect that in this famous text about the judgment of Rosh Hashanah, you have the tzaddik, the tzaddikim gemurin, and the Rishayim gemurin, and then you have the Benoni. And the difference over there, I'll just getting back to that text, there is no kind of categorical difference between the tzaddik and the Benoni. They're both being judged, or these characterizations of them are both rooted in the question of how well they have observed the law. And the tzaddikim gemurin have observed the law very well, and hence they are, go scot-free in judgment and quickly, whereas the Beinonim have observed the law only in a middling way. That's the contrast between the tzaddik and the Benoni. Whereas the contrast that one finds between the chassid and the Benoni is rather different. And this is one place in which one finds it. Arba midot ba'adam. There are 4 measures of a person, a famous passage in tractate Mishnah Avot. Ha'omer shali shali v'shalach shalach zo midah benonit. One who says, mine is mine, yours is yours. That's the average measure. V'yesh omrim zo midat stom. And then some say this is the measure of Sodom. A very, very striking statement. But also what I want to bracket for now. But that's the average measure. One who says yours is yours, mine is mine. Shali shalach, shalach shali am haaretz. One who says mine is yours, yours is mine. That is a kind of ignoramus. Why is that person I mean, it's just kind of one throws up one's hands. What does one to do with that? Why would you take mine and then give me yours? Shali shalach v'shalach shalach. Mine is yours is yours. That's the Hasid. Shali shali v'shalach shali. Yours is mine is mine. That is the Rasha. And so here, the contrast between the Hasid and the Benoni lies in the fact that the Benoni kind of holds to the, is following the Midah Benoni, this average measure, is accepting, one might say, the judgment of the law, right? The law which determines, what is mine, what belongs to me, what belongs to you, and that is the middle measure, the Midah Benonit, someone who simply sticks to the law and observes property rights, whereas the Hasid is the one who exceeds that, acknowledges the other's rights, and then also gives of his own to the other. And so this is the contrast between tzaddik and Hasid. I note also just a question over here in the chat about Judah saying that Tamar is more righteous than him. Tzadka mimeni. Yes, how one deals with that passage is an interesting question. Whether that is a righteousness instance or an innocence instance, because that is, after all, a case involving judgment. So that's a complicated one. That would be interesting to get back to. But all right, but here we have this contrast then between the tzaddik and the Hasid, so what I want to I guess argue then, bringing together these different strands, or these different features of the tzaddik that we've been speaking about, is that the tzaddik functions as one of those bridge concepts in rabbinic thought, one of those concepts through which halakhah kind of shows itself to be something other than simply law in the modern, in the modern Western sense, or even in the ancient Roman sense, but something that encompasses within itself a framework of perfection, rather than simply being the floor that needs to be exceeded in order to achieve perfection. And so the idea then is that the rabbinic tzaddik, in the way that it's defined and in the way that it figures in opposition to the Hasid, is doing that work of bridging, or is doing that work of putting forth halakhah as itself a path toward perfection. And how is it doing that? So in a couple of ways. So in that scalar way, in the fact that the tzaddik is a category that encompasses both the tzaddikim gemurin and someone who is simply above average, and so this is the kind of the structure of the category that emerges in those passages about judgment, and so it's indexed to judgment. The category of tzaddik is indexed to judgment, and to observance of the law, and yet it can reach the heights of the tzaddik gamor, and then also in the fact that the tzaddik is a kind of weak personality, right? If we think again, going back to these different normative structures, right? So character is that kind of normative category that is not really associated with law, right? Character and like modeling character, exemplars, that's not a category that has any role to play in the law. You don't look to someone in order to determine what the law is. Certainly the actions of a person doesn't determine what the law is, other than in, say, a totalitarian state, perhaps. Where character is the kind of thing that's the bread and butter of virtue discourse, and looking into a person who embodies that virtue. And to some extent, one can't define courage unless you kind of can point to a courageous person and say, this is what courage consists of. The law doesn't work that way at all. And so the tzaddik so the Chassid kind of as a character, as a strong character, you can see how the Chassid kind of, the work that the Chassid is going to do is to reinforce the distinction between law and ethics. The Chassid is the strong character who, as a character, is not going to be fitting within the contours of the law. Whereas the tzaddik is a character in the sense that you can speak about, when the tzaddikim come to the world, good comes to the world. And so you can, there is content there. And yet they're not these strong characters, right? And so you can't tell stories about them. So precisely that kind of like fluidity or that vagueness within the category of the tzaddik enables us, it's an evidence of the work that it is doing to try to figure the law as a vehicle of perfection. So there's the scalarity of the tzaddik. There is the notion of the tzaddik as a kind of a weak character, a character who's not altogether a character. And then there is precisely this distinction between the tzaddik and the chassid. And let me get to the last slide for a formulation of the way in which, the way in which I see these working together. And this is also, again, from this forthcoming article. So the chassid is the figure, I'll read through this and also stop to kind of parse it. The chassid is the figure through whom the rabbis give expression to the limit of the law. He is defined by contrast to the law and represents its endpoint, right? And so you find in the Babylonian Talmud the idea of a midat chasidut, of a measure of chasidut that is more or less a synonym for action lifnim mishurat hadin, action in excess of the law. The chassid in his excess, in his strong personhood, makes visible a normative structure defined by perfection. But in doing so, he reinforces the conceptual stability of the law as its own distinct normative structure, right? And that's the tricky thing over here, right? The tricky thing in these bridge concepts is to kind of gesture outward from the law without dissolving the law into mere propedeutic, a kind of preparation for perfection. And one could argue that Maimonides does do that, even as he doesn't allegorize. But so the kind of the trick in these bridge concepts is to remain within the framework of the law, even as one kind of offers a portrait of it as a framework for perfection. And so the work that the tzaddik does, it kind of works in tandem with the chassid in order to do this. So the chassid kind of reinforces the idea of the law as law. And that's precisely why the chassid is in excess of it in his kind of search for perfection. By contrast, the tzaddik, and now I'm continuing in this quotation, by contrast, the tzaddik, through his scalar character, his coupling of heroic righteousness with mere survival of judgment, his weak personhood, blurs the boundary between the law and what lies beyond it, and implicitly offers an integrated vision of the deontological and virtue elements of rabbinic normativity. Deontological being those categories of must, may not, and then the virtue elements are things like character and virtues and exemplars. Put differently, the chassid enables the rabbis to insist that halakhah really is law. But law in the sense of like American law, like Roman law, what you have to do, the floor, right? What everyone was expected of everyone. The halakhah really is law, and therefore it can be exceeded by the chassid. So the chassid enables the rabbis to insist that halakhah really is law, but through the tzaddik, they make the claim that law is not just law, right? That law is in fact this vehicle for perfection. All right, so that's the argument, and I mean it's a very kind of abstract structural argument. So I thank you for bearing with me as I work through it, and I'm not really totally sure. This is by way of kind of qualification of this entire enterprise, and really including this work that I've kind of been thinking about sort of from my dissertation and forward. I mean, I think about a lot of other things also, piyut and also those sorts of things. But in terms of these legal questions about legal normativity, so when you have like a category like mitzvah, which seems to bridge these two kind of normative structures, or ritual, which has a yatzah yedei chovato, this is what you need to do in order for the ritual to be effective, in order for you to fulfill your obligation, and then this is the way it ought to look when it's perfect. Lechatchila. When you have a category like tzaddik, which is blurring in these ways, what I'm not altogether sure about, assuming that I'm right even as far as I go, what I'm not altogether sure about is how one pins this down philosophically. Is this mere kind of rhetoric and a kind of a masking or blurring in the sense of a kind of easing over, papering over a certain kind of conceptual divide that can't really be bridged, but these are attempts to hold them together at the level of rhetoric, or do they actually really have a conceptual coherence to them that really, at a philosophical level, is bridging between these normative frameworks? And I don't know. I have not settled on an answer to that question. I am not sure. Yeah,
Dr. Novick, is it possible to say something?
Please, yes. So that was it.
Yeah.
So yes,
Okay.
please. Thank you. Yes.
No, just thank you very much. I appreciate you raised, I think, a lot of very interesting questions.
Mhm.
My sense is, and I'm interested in your response, my sense is that what you're suggesting is certainly true of something like din versus lifnim mishurat hadin. I think one can make the argument that one who keeps all the laws doesn't break the law. Not that law can cover all of human experience in the first place, but leaving that aside, the one who keeps the law, keeping the law lends itself or leads to even going beyond the law. And lifnim mishurat hadin, as you said, in midat chasidut, which may or may not be the same thing. But what strikes me is that when you talk about the Chassid, and you look at the Chassidim of the Babylonian Talmud, at least, Hanina ben Dosa. Hanina ben Dosa is not somebody who is more strict about his observance. That's not what Hanina ben Dosa is about at all, actually. It's a person that walks through the world in a completely different way.
Right.
He's living in a different universe. He reminds me of the rabbi in Toccoa several years ago, Menachem Fruman. Menachem Fruman is not more strict, less strict. He's a guy who leaves the yeshuv with no money in his pocket, no car. He has to get to Haifa in 2 hours. The same he always gets there. And you talk about people living a different way. Miracles for Hanina ben Dosa is the way he lives. So yes. I don't think actually you can. I think they're completely different in terms of the Chassid type. On the other hand, I think your point about bridge that keeping the rules, which is what the tzaddik does, in contrast to the Rosh who breaks rules. Yeah, that's a very important question and point that it actually can lead you to going beyond. Right. Type, but there's different type in my view.
Yeah, right. So that's interesting, right? Though I don't want to say that the tzaddik, right? I don't think that the implication. I'll start with the comment on the tzaddik and then get back to the chassid. I don't think I wasn't arguing anyhow for the idea that the figure of the tzaddik is suggesting that by observing the law one can kind of go further and beyond it. I think the way tzaddik is figuring in rabbinic normativity is to suggest that observance of the law itself is a way of there is a kind of perfect observance of the law that leads to perfection. So that it's the chassid who is going beyond. But to get to this point about the chassid, right? It's a very, very interesting idea. Benjamin Brown has a very interesting article on he's focusing on ultra orthodoxy and Haredi Judaism, and an interesting observation about, and this is something that has been noted in a number of contexts, about a kind of confluence of what he calls hypernomianism and antinomianism in the figure of the chassid, or this kind of perfect person. Whereas on the one hand, there's a hypernomianism, and they are observing the law down to the last detail with extra chumrot on all sides, and then also an antinomianism where they can feel free to violate the law. And those two things can coexist in very, very interesting ways. And so I agree with you. Yeah, that the chassid. It's when we use it in terms of lifnim mishurat hadin or even midat chasidut, we're implying here, of course, they've observed all the law, and then they're also going beyond. But then on the other hand, there is the chasid like Hanina ben Dosa, or Choni HaMe'agel, who's described as a chasid in the Tosefta Ta'anit parallel to the Mishnah, who are ultimately, what they're doing, I think they work together. I don't think that there's an incoherence there. I think the point over here is that the very fact, so the discourse of the Hasid is suggesting that the very fact that there's something that you ought to be doing in excess of the law is really telling you that there's a whole normative structure out there, independent of the law and better than the law. And the law is really only a floor. So I think the idea of the Hasid as that which exceeds the law, and the Hasid as the one who embodies a totally different kind of normative structure, a different way of being, are actually part of the same deal. And they're not two different types really, but that it's precisely the fact that there is an excess to the law that signals you to the fact that law is only kind of a small part of the normative space and not the best part of it. But the Hasid is right. It's of course a fascinating category unto himself or herself, Hasidah. But it's especially interesting then to see how it works kind of in correlation with the tzaddik. Okay, and I see. Well, so I see we're at the hour. Maybe I see a question in the chat about, well, I'm not sure what you mean by that the tzaddik has a weak personhood. To Rav Lichtenstein, going beyond the letter of the law is part of the law itself. Pirkei Avot, after all, is part of the Talmud, a halachic work. Well, right. So this is, yeah. I mean, this is all kind of very. I mean, there are different. These are. I think right. I mean, to say that going beyond the law. Well, I see two separate questions here. One about that tzaddik is a weak person, and the other a weak personhood or weak personality, and the other about whether the question of lifnim mishurat hadin or going beyond the letter of the law is part of the law itself. I think one could certainly say that. One could certainly put the point that way. That going beyond the letter of the law is part of the law itself. After all, I mean, it comes up in the Gemara, and in one case, with the case of midat, where midat chasidut occurs. I mean, this is it's a forensic context, and the defendant is told, you must do that. Yes, it's an obligation to do lifnim mishurat hadin, the hasita yashar v'atov and the like. And so so there's certainly a sense of obligation, but I suppose what I'm focusing on is the way in which, even as the category of lifnim mishurat hadin becomes a halachic category, it's one that acknowledges a difference between din and what is beyond it. And granted, in doing so within a halachic framework, it is already incorporating the lifnim mishurat hadin, but the rhetoric of it is to reinforce this idea of there's a certain floor, and then there is what is, and that's the law, and then there's what's in excess of it. And granted, yes, we may kind of incorporate the excess under certain circumstances into the law itself, but to me, I see that rhetoric as essentially reinforcing this idea of the law as floor, and what I want to suggest, right, is that we do nevertheless find within halachic discourse concepts that are genuinely bridging and that aren't creating that binary of din and lifnim mishurat hadin, or din and midat chasidut, as the Hasid does, a binary that reinforces the law in its limited fashion, but bridge concepts that suggest that the law itself is a field in which to cultivate perfection, and that is what I'm suggesting the figure of the tzaddik does. All right.
And sorry to jump on, I want to just highlight one more question from the Facebook live chat, which points out Elijah rebukes Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi for acting according to din and not midat chasidut.
Right. Yeah. So that's right. So yeah, the context in which these are coming up in the Gemara, right, and that's the context of Eliyahu, who is kind of a little bit distant from normative kind of halachic discourse, but you find it also in an actual court case where a rabbi is compelled to give schar sachir, to give the wages, even when he has suffered, even when the employees cause him a loss, and that's a kind of a conventional case. So clearly it is kind of incorporated into the law as an expectation, but nevertheless, right, I would say in a way that maintains and reifies that distinction between the law and what lies beyond it. All right, so yeah, so I guess we've passed the hour, so I want to so I'll stop there, and I think I will post yes to the chat my email. Happy to field further questions or comments. It's all very helpful. I mentioned this forthcoming article, but probably can still insert a change or two if and so I will certainly welcome feedback for that reason, but also because it's an abiding interest of mine. And I thank you for hearing me out and for your contributions and questions at this late hour.
All right, and thank you to Dr. Novick for joining us this evening, and thank you to everyone who joined us today on Zoom, on Grisha Live, and on Facebook. And it's been especially those who spoke up in chat or raised their hand. We are going to continue our Fallsman programming tomorrow at 8 p.m. with the final session of Prus Ball, a Talmud Shir, as well as a new series starting this Wednesday night at 8 p.m. Eastern called A Sabbath of the Land for You, Shemitah, Ethics, and Jewish Philosophy with Sarah Zieger and Ra'anana Dean. You can find more information on this class as well as all of our fall programming on our website at drisha.org/classes. Thank you, Dr. Novick, and for this opportunity to learn with you, and thank you and to everyone who attended. We hope to see everyone again soon. Have a good night.
Okay, good night. Thank you.
Good night.